Hi guys, Miss O'Connell. So remember that we decided that we are going to. I'm going to record the Vietnam lecture for you. There's one slide this week, one slideshow this week, and it's on Vietnam. And then we're going to watch the movie in class so you can write your paper on it. Because I know a lot of you don't have Amazon Prime or access to get that movie. So that is where we are at. So if you remember last week, we had been talking about communism, and the whole goal with the United States and communism is containment. That is what we wanted to do. We wanted to stop communism from escalating and to spreading to more places than it already was. So the United States, we had intervened in Korea. Nothing much happened in Korea other than it staying the way it was. And so now we're going to face something very similar in Vietnam. So let's give you a little bit of history on Vietnam. So Vietnam is the second longest war in U.S. history, although there's no actual proclamation of war. It's just extreme executive powers that allow us to get involved in the war. It's a proxy of the Cold War era. So this is, again, one of those times that the Cold War got hot, so to speak, much like the Cuban Missile Crisis, much like the Korean War. As far as U.S. casualties, okay, so 58,000 plus killed, 300,000 wounded, 14,000 disabled. The biggest thing here is that the Vietnam War is going to bring to light a lot of issues that returning soldiers have and veterans have with regards to PTSD. Okay. And part of the reason that happens is because of the way that veterans who are returning from Vietnam are treated. Vietnam was very much a war where public opinion was split about whether the U.S. should be involved or not. And that public opinion is going to turn into protests around the country. It's going to develop into this credibility gap of what the government is allowing the people to see and know, and the media giving them one side of things and the government trying to give them another side of things. So it's definitely a very contentious war. Okay, so the Vietnamese overview. This war is also known as the Second Indochina War. As far as casualties for the Vietnamese, 2 million dead, 2 million plus dead, 4 plus million wounded, and 10 plus million displaced from their homes. And we have to also look at the fact that we're going to be using new weapons like napalm and Agent Orange that are going to definitely play a role in casualties and the fact that Vietnam deals with a lot of the repercussions of those chemicals long after the war officially ends. All right, so what happens? So Vietnam, I mean, we could go back all the way to when Vietnam was part of French Indochina. You have Japan occupying Vietnam for a period of time. You have France occupying Vietnam for a period of time. You have the Viet Minh, which is led by Ho Chi Minh, which is trying to gain Vietnamese independence. And there's just a lot of conflict over who is ruling Vietnam. Okay, so obviously the Vietnamese are going to want their independence. And, you know, you have other people who are saying, no, this is controlled by Japan, by France. Okay, so in 2069, and the reason the U.S. gets involved is because Ho Chi Minh, communism. Okay, and putting communism into effect at this time, we had North Vietnam and we had South Vietnam. North Vietnam is very much a communist nation. South Vietnam is a democratic nation. So the U.S. wants to go to the support of South Vietnam at this time to contain that communism. But the question now becomes, what do we do? So it's interesting to look back on things as historians and say, okay, well, let's look in 2000, the year 2000, long after the Vietnam War ended. 69% of Americans judge the Vietnam War to be a mistake. Okay, over 50% don't have a clear idea what the war was about, and about 33% of Americans can remember which side the U.S. supported. So, you know, as far as what information is relayed to people about Vietnam, it's not something that I don't know if it doesn't get taught or if it doesn't get taught properly. And 50% of Americans did not know where Vietnam was located. Okay, and it's interesting because Nixon, who's going to be president after Johnson, goes on camera and has this huge map of Cambodia and where places are in Indochina, and he's trying to explain it to the American people. Okay, so what you can see is this graph to the right here, was sending troops to Vietnam a mistake? And it's interesting because 65 to 73, Eisenhower starts sending troops, and then Kennedy, and then Johnson, and it just escalates very, very quickly. And you can see that the majority of people 50 and over believe that sending troops, was kind of the right thing to do. People under 30, those are the ones who are going to see the most protest about the war. And then 30 to 49 is kind of in the middle of the era. Okay. So a little bit about information about the soldiers who were sent to Vietnam to try to help the South stop the spread of communism. 76% of the men sent to Vietnam were from lower middle class families. Okay. And that's why this is sometimes known as the working class war, because the people who were going to the war were ones who were lower middle class. The average age of a soldier was 22 years old. The average age of soldiers who were killed was 23. And 70% of those individuals who died had enlisted. Okay, so those are astounding numbers. Soldiers wind up serving what's known as a tour of duty, which was about a year long. And then it was reevaluated. But you have to understand that at this time, we had the draft, okay? And so I used to work with someone at Wait who was in the draft, and his number was in the draft, and it was kind of like the lottery in a way. It would come on, kind of like the Hunger Games in a way. And if they pulled your number, you had to report to your closest recruiting station in such a period of time, okay? So it was definitely interesting. There are going to be individuals who try to dodge the draft, which is, something that was very common, especially for the wealthy. That's why 76 of the men were from lower to middle class families. You had people who would get doctor's notes. If you were in college, you didn't have to enlist. That will change, but eventually, everyone was kind of fair game. So soldiers invented their own vocabulary. BC equaled body count. Boom boom was sex. Bought the farm, killed in action. VC or Charlie is what they referred to as the Viet Cong. Okay. So a lot of soldiers didn't return home in groups, or at the same time, they usually came home by themselves. A lot of times they would be injured. A lot of times they would come home dead in body bags. And if they did come home, they didn't come home unscathed. Mentally, it was such a dramatic situation to be in that they're going to struggle for years to come. Okay. So in 2000, 72% of Americans believe that Vietnam War veterans have been mistreated by the United States. And, if you look at the specifics of everything, we look at the fact that when they, look at World War I and World War II veterans, they were greeted with parades and, wonderful clapping and just love being showed upon them. And Vietnam veterans, when they came home, were greeted with people spitting at them and booing them and throwing things at them. And it's like they didn't have a choice. They were told what they had to do. And so to have the public come out and do this to them and treat them that way, that also messes with their mental state. All right. So a little bit of background on the war. So French Indochina, France had colonized parts of Southeast Asia in the 1880s, including Vietnam. Okay. And the Vietnamese were led by Ho Chi Minh, which I talked about before, who was communist. He begins to revolt during World War II and forms the Viet Minh. Okay. So after World War II, the Viet Minh gained control of Vietnam. And it's interesting because China turns communist in 1949, and so Ho Chi Minh had been sent a lot of aid by China. So France sees what's going on, and they attempt to regain control of France, or they attempt to regain control of Vietnam. The United States is an ally of France, and so the U.S. sends them aid. President Truman sends $15 million to France to help with the war, and the United States overall pays around 75 to 80% of France's military costs. So if we have that much money involved in this conflict, we care about what happens, okay? So ultimately, Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh defeat the French at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. So the French and the Communists sign the Geneva Accords to end the war. Laos and Cambodia, neighboring countries of Vietnam, become independent. And Vietnam itself is going to be split into North Vietnam, which is under communist control, and South Vietnam, which is non-communist. It was decided that elections would be held in 2 years in 1956 to decide government for the whole country. So Vietnam would be reunited, and it would either be democratic or it would be communist. All right, so reasons for U.S. involvement were kind of articulated in the language and policies of the Cold War. And like I said, this policy of containment that George Kennan and Truman had come up with, wanting to keep communism where it was. Okay, so after Truman is Eisenhower. He believed in the domino theory. So the idea that, if one country falls to communism, all these other countries would as well. So he believed that if North Vietnam and South Vietnam reunited, well, then Laos was going to become communist and Cambodia was going to become communist. Okay, so he wanted to stop the spread and not allow North Vietnam to reunite with the South and become communist. So Eisenhower supported a man by the name of Ngo Dinh Diem, who was an anti-communist, and he wanted to become president of South Vietnam. He sent 700 military personnel, as well as military and economic aid to the government of South Vietnam to help them. So, Eisenhower serves 2 terms, and he says in 1954, he discussed the importance of Indochina in terms of containment of communism and international trade. And he says, you have broader considerations that might follow you. You have broader considerations that might follow what you would call the falling domino principle. You have a row of dominoes set up. You knock over the first one, and what will happen to the last one is the certainty that it will go over very quickly. So you could have a beginning of a disintegration that would have the most profound influence. So that was his idea of the domino theory. One falls to communism, all of them fall to communism. All right, so you have 2 leaders in Vietnam, the North and the South. So in the North, you have Ho Chi Minh. But there are a lot of people in South Vietnam who don't like Diem, and they look to Ho Chi Minh for leadership, okay? Ho Chi Minh is considered a hero amongst many Vietnam because he broke up large estates and redistributed land to peasants. And he had beaten France, so in a lot of people's eyes, he was the hero. And then in the South, you have Ngo Dinh Diem, who was what a lot of people thought the United States had arranged for him to become president. And so there was a lot of questions there. And it didn't help that he ran a very corrupt government that suppressed anyone who opposed him. So if you spoke out against him, you were going to be punished in some way for that. And if you think about what democracy is and what the United States wanted to spread, that wasn't it, okay? He offered little or no land distribution to peasants, where Ho Chi Minh was, willing and able to do so. And he was a Catholic. And the problem was that most people living in South Vietnam at this time were Buddhist, okay? And so a lot of Diem's policies were very pro-Catholic, anti-Buddhist. And so Buddhists at this time were so upset. They don't show a lot of emotion, but they didn't believe in what he was doing. So to protest a lot of his policies, Buddhist monks set themselves on fire. And so, things in South Vietnam were not great under Diem's tutelage. So he ultimately gets assassinated during a military coup in 1963 the same year that JFK will get assassinated. All right, so in South Vietnam, we're going to have civil war. So by 1957, internal divisions are going to start to arise in South Vietnam. And they are going to be led by guerrilla fighters called the Viet Cong, who wanted to get rid of Diem from office. Okay? And so what you have to understand is that the Viet Cong are South Vietnamese who opposed Diem's role in office and supported Ho Chi Minh. So what wound up happening is that the Viet Cong received aid from Ho Chi Minh in North Vietnam, and it was received via the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which you can kind of see in red here. And they would transport supplies to the Viet Cong from North Vietnam so that they could be successful against Diem and his followers. All right, so Kennedy in Vietnam, as far as what Kennedy was responsible for, he dispatched General Maxwell Taylor and Special Assistant for National Security Affairs Walt Rostow on a fact-finding mission to Vietnam to see what was happening and if the United States needed to intervene. And they come back and they recommend to Kennedy that they send about 8,000 combat troops. And Kennedy says, no, we're not going to do that. Okay, I don't want to send out actual military at this time. So Kennedy did send military advisors to help the South Vietnam government. And it's a decent amount of advisors. When Kennedy is assassinated, about 16,000 advisors were in place. And what Kennedy's main argument was that the Vietnamese had to win the fight against communism themselves. It wasn't the U.S. Okay, the U.S. could come in probably and defeat North Vietnam, but if the South didn't do it, that would just leave them more susceptible to the North coming in even more. Sorry, that was my cat. All right, so in the final analysis, this is what Kennedy says. In the final analysis, it is their war. They are the ones who have to win it or lose it. We can help them. We can give them equipment. We can send our men out there as advisors, but they have to win it, the people of Vietnam against the communists. But I don't agree with those who say we should withdraw. That would be a great mistake. The United States made this effort to defend Europe. Now Europe is quite secure. We also have to participate. We may not like it in the defense of Asia. Okay, so he's setting it up. He's saying the U.S. is going to ultimately be the ones who have to help, but we can't win it for them. You know, we can aid them, but we can't be the ones who go in there and do it for them. So we're going to have something known as the Gulf of Tonkin incident that kind of pushes the U.S. into this conflict. So in August of 1964, the USS Maddox, which was a United States ship, was attacked by the North Vietnamese, their torpedo boats in the Gulf of Tonkin. So a second incident is going to occur when the USS Sea Turner Joy believed it was under attack. So President Lyndon Johnson, who is president after Kennedy is assassinated, is going to go to Congress, and he decides that he is going to ask Congress for aid to be sent to South Vietnam because of all of these incidents against U.S. ships. So he says, as President of the United States, I have concluded that I should now ask the Congress on its part to join in affirming the national determination that all such attacks will be met. So basically he's saying we can't just allow North Vietnam to attack our boats and not do anything about it. Now, there's going to be a lot of discussion years later if these boats actually were attacked or not. But at this time, this is what President Johnson does. So he goes to Congress and he asks for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. And it's passed by Congress in support of Johnson's proposals. So this is what they had to say. It says the Congress approves and supports the determination of the President as Commander-in-Chief to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. The United States is prepared to take all necessary steps, including the use of armed force to assist any member or protocol state of the Southeast Asia Defense Treaty requesting assistance in defense of its freedom. So what it's saying is that Johnson, this wasn't a declaration of war by Congress. There's no declaration of war. What it's saying is that Congress has given Johnson the right to take whatever measures he feels is necessary to make sure that the United States isn't attacked anymore. So Lyndon Johnson is going to wind up escalating U.S. involvement in the war. His Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, makes the recommendation that more U.S. troops be sent. Okay? So ultimately, we're going to talk a little bit more about the Vietnam War and why there was so much conflict regarding if the United States should have been there. And there's going to be college campus protests. There's going to be all of these protests that exist coming up. And we have to dissect on whether or not the United States is going to be successful. So kind of flash forward here, and eventually the United States will pull out of the war between the North and the South. Again, no formal declaration. But Lyndon Johnson doesn't run for re-election in 1968. Richard Nixon will be elected, and he starts Vietnamization, which will get troops out of the United States or out of Vietnam. And ultimately Vietnam will invade Cambodia, and Vietnam will merge into North and South Vietnam, into one Vietnam, and will become a communist nation. So definitely we're not done talking about Vietnam, but hopefully this gives you some good background going into when we start to watch our film. Okay, and if you have any questions, I'm more than willing to answer them in class.